Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a preview of the 10 best recordings of Carlo Maria Giulini. Now, all of these previews, if you've been watching them, are freestanding videos, which you can hopefully enjoy on their own merits. But this is also, because it's a preview of the 10 best recordings video, which you can find on ClassicsToday.com if you are a ClassicsToday.com insider subscriber. And I hope you will consider becoming one, because now we are already up to number 8 in our survey of major and some not so major conductors. Let me see, who have we done so far? I have the list here. So we've done Klemperer, Toscanini, Stokowski, Simon Rattle, Pierre Boulez, Herbert von Karajan, and Adrian Bolt. And that's really a pretty decent selection. But if you want to see those videos and get the top 10 recommendations, please join Classics Today as an insider subscriber, where you can watch the videos ad-free with sound clips and other goodies to tantalize you, if you will. And you can find out how to subscribe with the link that's in the description of this very video. But for now, let's talk about Giulini. Carlo Maria Giulini. What a fascinating conductor he was. I think the question I want to consider with him, and going through his whole discography, which I do before I do these talks, and, sampling stuff and listening, was he really spiritual or was he just dull? That's the question that we need to answer. When is spirituality actually nothing but tedium in disguise? Now, he was not naturally a boring kind of guy. He was a fascinatingly serious guy. He actually managed to have a career which he did his way because he was modest, he was pleasant, he was easy to work with, but he was also so serious in what he was doing. He wouldn't conduct opera most of the time because he couldn't get enough rehearsal. When he went to Los Angeles, he insisted on limiting his engagements. He understood the value in scarcity. He was like Carlos Kleiber in that respect, although Kleiber took it to a ridiculous extreme. Giulini had a much wider repertoire. He recorded quite a bit more. But he, too, he limited what he would do. He limited his appearance. He made sure that he got the conditions he wanted. He really only made records with very major orchestras. I mean, his whole discography essentially is the Philharmonia in the UK, the Chicago Symphony, and the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and the Vienna Philharmonic, and the Berlin Philharmonic. And it's just really quite a selection of orchestras that he worked with, primarily, only the best. And he considered himself the best. And one of the things about the classical music industry that I'm sure you've realized right now is that people would much rather talk about it than listen to it when it comes to music. And when it comes to these people's careers, if you could create a persona, and boy, did he have a persona, then you're in business. You're in fabulous, fabulous shape. But the interesting thing, even more interesting to me, is that his career on records was a very, very curious one. There are multiple versions of just about everything because he limited his repertoire. He was one of the few conductors, one of the best conductors, the greatest conductors of the 20th century, who never made a complete Beethoven cycle in any one place. You can assemble one from various sources, but basically he never did one in one spot. He almost did with La Scala at the very end of his career, but by then he really did decline as he got older. Let's not kid ourselves. He got slower, as Klemperer did, and I think he was sort of trapped in this reverie about, just the spiritual wonderfulness of it all. And sometimes he really did get to be kind of snoozy. At other times, he woke up and was really quite thrilling. He really was. So there's a lot of good stuff, and it's spread out throughout his career. isn't one phase that was notably better than any other. It depended on the music that he was conducting. One thing he really did do, and I think that this is a very, very important aspect of his personality. He first sort of became known as the conductor of one of the Maria Callas La Traviatas in the mid-50s. The 1955 recording is sort of the standard Callas Traviata that EMI trots out. And it's live and it sounds like hell, but he was the conductor for that. Was that his conducting of Italian music, particularly Italian opera, and again, he was very selective in what he did. It's a handful of Verdi operas and other things, but he was so refined without being boring. I mean, he didn't try to spiritualize music that really wasn't terribly spiritual to begin with. And, La Traviata is not the most spiritual of pieces, but he conducted this music with great refinement and seriousness in a way that elevated the music, that precluded any hint of vulgarity. And that was him. That was really, really him. It was his character and his personality. He treated all of that music like it was great music. And if the accompaniment was just he really made it sound like it mattered. I mean, I remember his recording of La Traviata. I mean, not La Traviata, Il Trovatore, which isn't terribly good, with Rosalind Plowright and Placido Domingo. I mean, it's a fairly heavy-duty Il Trovatore. I mean, it's an opera that really needs lots of blood and thunder, and this doesn't have so much blood and thunder, but it has amazing detail. I mean, even in Di Quella Pira, when the orchestra's just going, the way that he gets them to articulate these accompaniments as if they really, really matter. And of course, when you play them that way, they do matter. And one of the things Giulini was able to demonstrate, where you might least expect it, is that there is no such thing as bad music, only bad performances of music that's made to sound bad. He had it was a widely varied, but at the same time limited repertoire of stuff that he kept doing over and over and over again. And it was very curious to hear, the differences between one version and the next. Sometimes the later ones were better, sometimes the early ones were better, but it was all carefully selected. You could tell the care that went into it. And when he was bad, and he had his boring moments, he really did, his dull moments, was when he was, I think, a little bit overwhelmed by the greatness of it all and his own humility, his own questioning his ability to rise to the occasion. This is true of his Beethoven, sometimes his Mozart, his orchestral Mozart, that is. He was sometimes so careful and so serious that it just sucked the juice out of the music. And, that was the risk you take when you play music at that level. He was always reaching for a certain level of perfection and elegance and class in everything that he did. And, it was an on-again, off-again experience. In that respect, he was no different from anyone else. And I have a feeling he would have been the first person to admit it. I really do. But I just want to run through now for a bit some of his discographic history, just to show you how curious it really is. Most of his recordings, like I said, they're either on Warner or Deutsche Grammophon, or at the end of his career, Sony. Because remember, Sony had wads of money because Sony was CBS. It was bought by the Japanese. They sucked up Karajan's videos. They got Claudio Abbado. They spared no expense. And they got all these people to re-record the same stuff they'd done a million times elsewhere. And Giulini was no exception. Giulini's Sony legacy is particularly desperate in my point of view, because it's so lacking in repertoire originality, although there are some marvelous performances. Anyway, his Warner stuff is you can mostly find in, aside from the operas, the operas and big choral works, which always get excluded from these box sets, it seems to be, largely, I think, because of the cost of royalties and paying all the other people involved. But here we have 3 boxes that were on Warner. There was this big one, which is the London Years, which consists of 17 CDs. And then after the London Years, there was a small little box of Chicago Years, because he had two wads of conducting in Chicago. One in the late 60s, early 70s, when Schulte was just starting, and then later on, when he made recordings for Deutsche Grammophon in Chicago, which were contemporaneous with some of his stuff in Los Angeles as well. Anyway, so you have his Chicago stuff, which is only 1, 2, 3, 4 discs. Not a lot of stuff. And then there's a 9-disc set of concerto accompaniments. And Giulini really was not the best concerto accompanist, I think, because he was not one to simply be satisfied merely to accompany. I think he really wanted to be center stage, because his conception of a work was so powerful and so deep and probing that just to be able to sit there and let the soloist do his thing was something that he was unwilling to do. And when he did have a soloist like Aral, for example, the Brahms piano concertos and whatnot, the result could often be rather too probing, somewhat mannered, and a little bit dull, whereas you just want to have like some ability to let go. You will not hear in Giulini a great deal of spontaneity in his performances, but they aren't mannered either. I mean, they could be. I mean, but the best ones, are, you just understand that the guy's really digging around and uncovering everything there is to uncover. Anyway, so that was his EMI stuff. Then we come to his Universal, which is basically Deutsche Grammophon stuff. Now, Deutsche Grammophon put out a big Giulini box, which is sitting up there, but I'm not going to risk, having a cataclysm happen by trying to pull out everything and get it down. So you'll take my word for it. Besides, as with the EMI stuff, they originally, Deutsche Grammophon, did a bunch of little boxes. It was what I call the Iphigenia in Brooklyn approach. It was Giulini in Vienna, and Giulini in America, and Giulini in Alaska, and Giulini in South Africa, and Giulini, it was every major city or country he visited. So there was a fairly large Giulini in Vienna box, which has 15 CDs. And then there were a couple Giulini in Americas. There was a Chicago one and a Los Angeles one. I don't think they ever got to Giulini in Berlin before the big box came out. But that would have basically covered his Deutsche Grammophon legacy. And in Vienna, it was either Vienna Philharmonic, or for those Beethoven concertos he did with Michelangelo, it was the Wiener Symphoniker, of which he was actually the music director for a few years. He didn't stay any particular place for large lengths of time, because I think he always got sick of the situation. It just began to offend his sensibility, because nobody was as serious as he was. There's a limit, like I said, whether it's spiritual or whether it's boring, between being elevated and serious and just having, tremendous egomania. If he hadn't been so humble, if he hadn't been such a kind and unassuming and lovely person, I have no doubt that he would have been as obnoxious as like Theodore Karensis, or one of those hotshot guys who thinks that, God is speaking to him through music. You know what I mean? That was where he could have been headed had he not had that self-discipline and that natural modesty. So anyway, his last sort of batch of stuff was on Sony. And here it is in a box. And this was like I said, there's 22 CDs. This was like the end of career desperation album, because this is all stuff, or for the most part stuff, let's say. I don't know if he did Bach's B minor Mass, and there are a couple other things here that he hadn't done before, but 90% of it is stuff that he recorded before on multiple occasions. I mean, they even have Ravel's Mother Goose Suite twice here. Once as a coupling to that obvious coupling, the Dvorak Eighth Symphony, which of course you always want to hear with Ravel's Mother Goose Suite, and then on a Debussy and Ravel disc. Sony was so odd when they were just throwing money at things. And that's what they were doing. I mean, Giulini, of course, tried his best to make sure that, what he did rose to his standard. But sometimes I just think he had an ego and it got in the way. He had his Beethoven cycle here with La Scala, which is missing everything except you know what. That last of the symphonies. I'm not going to do the thing with the tie because it's too complicated to talk about this one thing. And the La Scala Orchestra wasn't the absolute best. The performances are very slow, and you feel a little bit like it's too little, too late. By the time he was finally ready for it, he was no longer ready for it, and that's what happens with these things. You pays your money and you takes your chances, right? He waited and waited and waited and waited, and he waited too long. But there are marvelous, marvelous recordings, as I said, throughout his career, and I just find him a little bit of a cipher, because you've got, for example, Dvorak's Eighth Symphony at least 3 times, 4 times, and you have to wonder, how is it that a conductor who consistently insisted on the highest standards could keep making recordings of the same music over and over again? Was it because he was unsatisfied? Are his newer recordings a tacit disapproval of his older recordings? Or did he just feel that he was so wonderful or had new ideas that he wanted to I don't know what the answer is. I truly don't know what the answer is. All I know is that he leaves behind a legacy that is extremely varied. And in that, he's no different from anybody else. Somehow, it's amazing to me how a consistently high level of quality somehow is incompatible with being a very, very self-critical judge of one's own work on disc. I can't explain it. And Giulini is sort of the enigma on top of the riddle who really encompasses that, because everybody took him so seriously, including himself, and deservedly so. Deservedly so. Let's be honest. He earned it. He lived it. He was a great musician, a musician of tremendous probity and depth when he was hot, when he was on. But on the other hand, he just kept recording the same stuff. So that makes it all the more important that we discuss what his 10 best recordings are. And so once again, I urge you please to subscribe to ClassicsToday.com Insider, and you can watch that video too. So keep on listening, folks. Thanks for joining me. Take care.